Close your eyes. Let the modern world slip away. Feel yourself drifting backward through time, through centuries of comic books and movie screens, past the horned helmets and fantasy novels, past the video game warriors and heavy metal album covers. Go further still, back through the mists of legend and myth, until you reach a cold, dark shore somewhere in Scandinavia more than 1,000 years ago. It is winter in the late 8th century. The year does not matter. These people do not count years as we do. What matters is the season, the weather, the position of the sun. And tonight, the sun has barely risen above the horizon before beginning its descent again. The darkness here is not merely the absence of light. It is a presence, thick and heavy, pressing down on the scattered villages that cling to this harsh coast. Listen. Do you hear it? The howl of wind through pine forests, the crack of ice on a distant lake, the low rumble of the sea. And beneath it all, if you listen very carefully, the sound of men singing. Deep voices, rhythmic, hypnotic, building towards something that sounds less like music and more like a storm gathering strength. Inside a longhouse, smoke from the central fire rises toward the roof beams. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies pressed together against the cold. Warriors sit in a circle, their faces half illuminated by dancing flames. They wear fur and leather, wool and iron. Their beards are long, their hair braided or loose. Some bear scars, white lines across faces, missing fingers, the marks of a life lived by the sword. But there are others here, sitting slightly apart, different. You sense it before you see it clearly. Something in the way they hold themselves, something in their eyes. These are the berserkers, the bear warriors, the men who fight without armor, who feel no pain, who enter a state of such savage fury that they become, for a time, something more, or perhaps something less, than human. Forget what you think you know. The berserkers were not simply fierce fighters. They were not merely brave warriors who charged into battle without fear. What they were is stranger, more complex, and more deeply woven into the fabric of Viking Age society than any modern retelling has captured. This is their story, the real story. Not the fantasy, not the myth, but the historical reality of men who stood at the intersection of warrior culture, religious belief, social structure, and perhaps something else, something we still struggle to fully understand, even with all our modern knowledge. They were feared, they were honored, they were outlawed. They were the king's elite guard. They were holy warriors, blessed by the gods. They were dangerous madmen shunned by society. They were all of these things, at different times, in different places, as the Viking Age unfolded across 3 centuries of Northern European history. To understand the berserkers, we must first understand the world that created them. A world of long winters and short summers, of scarce resources and violent competition, of gods who valued courage above all else, of a society where reputation was life itself and a good death was the highest achievement. We must understand the North, the real North, not the romanticized landscape of tourist brochures or fantasy games, but the brutal, beautiful, unforgiving place that forged a people who would leave their mark across the known world, from Baghdad to Newfoundland, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle. Take a breath. Settle yourself. The journey we are about to undertake will carry us through centuries of history, through sagas and archaeological sites, through the halls of kings and the chaos of battlefields. We will examine weapons and rituals, chemical compounds and religious beliefs, social structures and individual madness. We will try to answer the questions that have fascinated historians and captured imaginations for more than a millennium. Who were the berserkers really? What made them different? How did they achieve their legendary battle fury? What role did they play in Viking society? And why did they disappear? The answers are not simple, they are not complete, but they are far more interesting than the legends suggest. The firelight flickers. The wind howls outside. The warrior's song continues, building toward something primal and ancient. And in the darkness beyond the firelight, shapes seem to move. Perhaps only shadows, perhaps something more. This is where it begins. In the cold north, in the long darkness, among a people who lived close to the edge of survival, and closer still to the gods they believed watched over them, judging their courage, awaiting their arrival in the halls of the dead. The berserkers are waiting in that darkness. Let us meet them. Picture Scandinavia in the early medieval period, between roughly 750 and 1050 CE, the era we call the Viking Age. This is not one unified nation, but a patchwork of petty kingdoms, chiefdoms, and independent farmsteads scattered across a landscape that seems designed to keep people apart. Mountains rise like walls between valleys. Fjords cut deep into the coastline, creating hundreds of isolated communities accessible only by boat or by treacherous mountain passes that become impassable in winter. Norway stretches along the western coast, a narrow strip of habitable land pressed between mountains and sea. Sweden occupies the eastern portions, around vast lakes and through dense forests that seem to stretch forever. Denmark sits at the southern gateway, controlling the entrance to the Baltic Sea and the easiest land routes to the wealthy kingdoms of Central Europe. The climate is harsh. Winters are long, dark, and bitterly cold. In the far north, the sun disappears entirely for months at a time. Even in the southern regions, winter means months of frozen ground, livestock huddled in shelters, people confined to their homes, surviving on whatever food they managed to store during the brief growing season. Summer, when it comes, is brief but intense. The sun barely sets. Fields must be plowed, planted, and harvested in a narrow window of opportunity. Fishing expeditions must be mounted. Repairs to buildings and boats must be completed. Trade voyages must be undertaken. Raids must be launched. Because the land itself cannot support the population. This is the fundamental reality of Viking Age Scandinavia. Good farmland is scarce. The growing season is short. Large families, and these people had large families, quickly exhaust the productive capacity of their inherited lands. Younger sons face a choice. Accept a diminished position under an older brother's authority, clear new land from forest or mountainside through back-breaking labor, or seek fortune elsewhere. Through trade, perhaps, through service to a powerful lord, through the taking of wealth from those who have it. This is not a justification for Viking raids. Morality is not our concern here, but an explanation. The violence that would make the Vikings infamous across Europe did not emerge from innate savagery or pagan bloodlust. It emerged from economic pressure, geographic limitation, and a cultural system that valued boldness, rewarded successful violence, and measured a man's worth by his reputation and his ability to provide for his followers. Into this world of scarcity and competition, where reputation was everything and a warrior's courage determined his place in society, the berserkers emerged as something extraordinary. Not merely brave warriors, the North produced thousands of those, but something more extreme, more ritualized, more deeply connected to the religious beliefs that gave meaning to Viking life. To understand the berserkers, we must first understand how Viking Age Scandinavians saw the world and their place in it. They did not separate the natural from the supernatural as we do. The world was alive with powers, spirits in the forests, in the mountains, in the sea. The gods were not distant creators, but present forces who involved themselves directly in human affairs. A good harvest was Freyr's blessing. A storm at sea was the work of Njord, or perhaps the sea goddess Ran, claiming sailors for her underwater haul. Victory in battle came through Odin's favor, or perhaps through Thor's raw strength lending itself to worthy warriors. And the boundary between human and animal was not as fixed as we imagine. The sagas speak of Hamramr, shape-strong ones, individuals who could send their spirit out in animal form while their body slept. They speak of Fylgjur, spiritual guardians or followers that often took animal form and whose fate was tied to their human. They speak of men who bore the hamr, the shape or form of beasts, who could access animal strength and fury. The berserkers existed in this worldview. They were not simply warriors who worked themselves into a frenzy. They were men who had achieved something sacred and terrifying. They had accessed the hamr of the bear or the wolf, had taken on the attributes of these most powerful predators, had blurred the boundary between man and beast in a way that gave them supernatural battle prowess. But this power came at a cost. The sagas make this clear, though modern retellings often ignore it. The berserker fury was not entirely under conscious control. It could not simply be turned on and off like a switch. Once it began, it had to run its course, and the aftermath was often devastating. Exhaustion so complete that the warrior could barely move for hours or days, periods of depression and withdrawal. Sometimes violence turned against friends and family when the fury struck at inappropriate times. The berserkers were sacred and dangerous, honored and feared, useful and unstable. They were not the invention of saga writers or later romantics. Archaeological evidence confirms their existence. Historical chronicles from across Europe mention them. The word itself, berserker, appears in contemporary sources. They were real. But understanding who they really were requires us to look carefully at the evidence, to separate fact from later embellishment, to understand the cultural context that made such warriors possible. The fire burns lower, the wind still howls outside, and we are only beginning to understand. The word itself carries meaning worth examining. Berserker. In Old Norse, it breaks down into two components, ber and serker. Serker is straightforward. It means shirt or coat, related to the modern English word sark that survives in some regional dialects. But ber is where the meaning becomes interesting and slightly debated. The most common interpretation, ber means bear. Thus, berserker becomes bear shirt or bear coat, one who wears the hide or spirit form of a bear. This interpretation is supported by numerous saga descriptions of berserkers wearing bear pelts into battle, by the association of berserkers with bear symbolism, and by the animal's importance in Norse culture. But some scholars have proposed an alternative. Perhaps bear derives from ber, meaning bare or naked. In this reading, berserker would mean bare of shirt or without armor, a reference to the berserker practice of fighting without the protective mail that other elite warriors wore. Both interpretations may be correct. Language is not always precise. A word can carry multiple meanings, can accumulate associations over time. The berserkers may have been called this both because they wore bear hides and because they fought without armor. The two meanings reinforce each other. The bear is a creature that needs no armor, whose hide and strength are sufficient protection. And the berserker who takes on the bear's hammer likewise needs no mail, no shield, nothing but his fury and his weapons. The earliest certain reference to berserkers appears in the Hrafnsmal, a poem that can be dated to the 9th century. It describes warriors of King Harald Fairhair, who ruled Norway from roughly 872 to 930 CE. Berserkers were they called, bear shirts who bore shields. They were red with blood and their weapons dripped gore. In battle, neither fire nor iron could harm them. This is poetic exaggeration, certainly. The berserkers were not literally invulnerable. They bled and died like any warrior. But the poet is expressing something important about their reputation. They were perceived as transcending normal human limitations through their battle fury. Other early sources confirm their existence as a distinct category of warrior. The Ynglinga saga, part of Heimskringla, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, but drawing on much earlier material, describes Odin's warriors. His men went without coats of mail and were mad as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields and were as strong as bears or bulls. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron could hurt them. This is called going berserk. Notice the details. Unarmored, compared to both dogs and wolves as well as bears. Biting their shields, displaying strength beyond normal, seemingly impervious to injury. And that final phrase, this is called going berserk. The Old Norse is "tat kallaður berserksgangur," the berserker going, the berserker state, the act of entering the fury.
Archaeological evidence adds physical reality to these literary descriptions. Graves throughout Scandinavia have yielded what appear to be berserker burials, warriors interred with unusual weapon collections, with bare teeth or claws, with objects suggesting ritual significance beyond standard warrior equipment. One particularly striking find from Birka in Sweden, dating to the mid-900s, contained the skeleton of a powerful warrior buried with weapons, and notably with what appeared to be bear claws strung as a necklace. Chemical analysis of the bones suggested a diet rich in meat and evidence of repeated trauma. Healed fractures, suggesting a life of intense violence, survived through exceptional constitution or perhaps medical care provided by someone who valued this warrior highly. Other finds include amulets depicting warriors in what may be states of fury, figurines of men that seem to be transforming into bears, and gaming pieces that show warriors biting shields, a gesture so closely associated with berserkers that it became their visual signature. But when did the berserkers first emerge? Were they an ancient tradition reaching back into the prehistoric past, or a development of the Viking Age itself? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. No written records survive from Scandinavia before the Viking Age. We have archaeological evidence of warrior cultures stretching back thousands of years, but we cannot know if those ancient warriors included anything like berserkers. What we can say is that the berserkers, as a recognized category of warrior with specific characteristics and social roles, emerge into historical visibility during the Viking Age. The early 9th century sees the first clear references. By the 10th century, they appear regularly in sagas, poems, and even in the chronicles of non-Scandinavian writers who encountered them. They may represent the intensification or formalization of older traditions. The idea of warriors taking on animal attributes, of spiritual transformation in battle, of sacred fury granted by the gods, these concepts likely have deep roots in Germanic culture. The specific phenomenon of the berserkers as we understand them may be a Viking Age expression of much older ideas. The bear itself held profound significance in Norse culture. It was the largest predator in Scandinavia, feared and respected. Bear hunting was a test of courage and skill. Bear meat was prized. Bear pelts were valuable trade goods. In mythology, bears were associated with strength, with protection, with the wild places beyond human settlement. To take on the hammer of the bear was to access this power, to become temporarily something more than merely human. But it required preparation, ritual, perhaps divine blessing. Not every warrior could become a berserker, just as not every hunter could successfully kill a bear.
The process of becoming a berserker was not, it seems, simply a matter of choosing to enter a fury. These sagas suggest it was something some men had a natural capacity for, an inherent ability that could be developed through training and ritual, but that not everyone possessed. Some families seem to produce berserkers more regularly than others, suggesting a hereditary component. The Hrafsmal mentions that Harald Fairhair had a specific group of berserkers in his service, his elite bodyguard. These were not random warriors, but carefully selected, trained, and maintained as a specialized fighting force. This raises questions we will explore in later chapters. How did one become a berserker? What training was involved? What rituals prepared a warrior for the transformation? What role did substances, mushrooms, herbs, alcohol play in inducing the battle fury? And what happened to berserkers in peacetime, when the fury had no productive outlet? For now, we simply establish this. The berserkers emerged in Viking Age Scandinavia as a distinct category of warrior, associated with bears and wolves, fighting without armor, entering states of extraordinary fury, valued by kings and chieftains for their battle prowess, and occupying a unique and somewhat ambiguous place in Norse society. Sacred warriors blessed by Odin, or dangerous madmen who destabilized the social order. Perhaps both. The distinction between berserkers and ulfhednar, wolfcoats, requires attention as well. The berserkers had brothers in fury. The ulfhednar, the wolfcoats, were warriors who bore the hammer of the wolf rather than the bear. The distinction was significant to the Norse themselves, who understood bears and wolves as fundamentally different animals, with different qualities and different symbolic meanings. The bear was solitary, immensely strong, a creature of the deep forest. It was associated with physical power, with endurance, with the ability to survive harsh winters through inner resources. The bear was, in many ways, like the ideal Viking warrior, strong, fearless, able to stand alone if necessary. The wolf, on the other hand, was a pack animal, cunning, cooperative, a hunter that succeeded through teamwork and strategy as much as strength. Wolves were associated with Odin even more directly than bears. The god was attended by two wolves, Geri and Freki, who ate from his table in Valhalla. The wolf was intelligence and savagery combined, social and yet wild. The ulfhednar fought as wolves fought, in groups, coordinating attacks, striking from unexpected angles, using speed and cunning as much as raw strength. The berserkers, by contrast, seemed more likely to fight as individual champions, each a force unto himself.
While the distinction between berserkers and ulfhednar is real, it should not be overstated. Historical sources often group them together, treating both as variations of a phenomenon rather than entirely separate categories.
The Vatsnidola saga refers to berserkers and wolfcoats as though they were naturally paired, and the Volsunga saga describes warriors who could shift between these formidable forms. Both groups shared the remarkable ability to go out of their own skin, entering a state where normal human constraints no longer applied, where pain could be ignored, fear vanished, and the strength and fury of predatory animals coursed through their very being. The archaeological record provides tantalizing evidence of Ulfhednar alongside berserker evidence. Wolf teeth and claws appear in warrior graves, sometimes mixed with bear remains, suggesting some warriors may have claimed association with both animals. Gaming pieces portray warriors adorned in wolf pelts as well as bear hides, and amulets depict figures with wolf-like features. From one extraordinary find in Gotland, we observe what appears to be a warrior dance or ritual, participants donning animal heads and skins, some clearly bears and others clearly wolves, moving in a circle around a central figure. This vividly illustrates a ritual preparation for battle, or perhaps a ceremonial reenactment of the transformation process. In literary sources, both berserkers and Ulfhednar are described as part of the Einherjar, Odin's chosen warriors, destined to fight for him at Ragnarok, the epic final battle at the end of time. Odin was not merely a god of wisdom and magic. He was, perhaps primarily, the deity of warriors and warfare, the god who determined victory and defeat, selecting warriors who would die in glorious battle to be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla. Odin's association with ecstatic states, frenzy, and transcending normal consciousness reveals the profound connection of these warriors to Norse religious belief. The word oath in Old Norse signifies fury, inspiration, and divine madness. It is also the root of Odin's name. He is the furious one, the inspired one, the harbinger of divine madness. The berserker fury was, thus, a gift from Odin, a temporary sharing in the god's own formidable nature.
This religious dimension helps explain why berserkers and Ulfhednar were not simply tolerated, but honored and even revered, despite the danger they represented. They were not merely good fighters. They were men touched by the divine, men who had achieved a sacred state that brought them closer to the gods themselves. But this divine blessing could also be a curse. The sagas are full of stories about berserkers who could not control their fury, who turned violent at inappropriate times, who brought destruction on their own families and communities. The line between sacred warrior and dangerous madman was evidently quite thin. The Egil's saga tells of Egil Skallagrimsson's father and grandfather, both of whom had the berserker nature. The grandfather, Kveldulf, evening wolf, was so named because his fury came upon him in the evenings, making him dangerous to be around after dark. The father, Skallagrim, once attacked his own son during a ball game, killing another boy when Egil escaped. These were not enemies in battle, but uncontrolled outbursts of fury that could not be directed or contained. This darker side of the berserker phenomenon becomes more prominent in later sources as Christianity spread through Scandinavia and the old religious framework that made sense of sacred fury began to crumble. Without the context of Odinic blessing, berserkers became simply violent madmen, outlaws, creatures to be hunted down and killed for the safety of society. But we are moving ahead of our story. In the Viking Age proper, during the 9th and 10th centuries, when Norse paganism still held sway and the warrior culture remained ascendant, berserkers and Ulfhednar occupied honored positions in society, despite their dangers. They were the champions who fought in duels on behalf of chieftains. They were the elite guards who protected kings.
They were the shock troops who led assaults on defended positions. They were the warriors whose mere reputation could sometimes win battles without a blow being struck, because enemies fled rather than faced them. They were the bear shirts and the wolf coats, the men who went berserk, the warriors of Odin who fought with the fury of beasts and the blessing of the gods. And to understand how they achieved this state, we must now turn to the battle fury itself, what it was, how it manifested, and what might have caused it. What did it feel like to go berserk? To enter the state that gave these warriors their name and their fearsome reputation?
We must rely primarily on literary descriptions, written by saga authors who were not themselves berserkers, but who drew on oral traditions, on stories passed down through generations, on cultural memories of what these warriors had been like. The descriptions share common elements. The fury came upon the warrior gradually or suddenly, depending on the circumstance. Sometimes it required ritual preparation, chanting, drumming, specific movements or gestures. Sometimes it erupted spontaneously in response to anger or fear or the heat of battle itself. The physical manifestations were unmistakable. The sagas describe warriors whose bodies began to shake and tremble, who grew hot despite the cold, so hot that steam rose from their bodies, whose faces contorted, whose eyes bulged and rolled, who bit their shields or the edges of their weapons, who howled like animals, making sounds no human throat should produce. The Ynglinga saga states, "His men went without mailcoats and were mad as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields and were as strong as bears or bulls. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron could hurt them." The Haufs saga, Oka Halfsrekka, describes berserkers this way. They were mad with fury and had the strength of trolls. They felt no pain, and it was as though fire ran through their bodies. The Grettis saga speaks of berserkers who trembled and shook, biting the rims of their shields, plunging into icy water, and sometimes even killing each other in their frenzy before the battle began. Notice the recurring themes: superhuman strength, imperviousness to pain, loss of normal human control, comparison to predatory animals, heat in the body, violent trembling, aggressive displays before combat. Modern readers might be tempted to dismiss these as poetic exaggeration, as the embellishment of storytellers making heroes larger than life. But the consistency across multiple sources, combined with what we know about human psychology and physiology, suggests these descriptions captured something real. The human body, under extreme stress, can enter altered states. The fight or flight response floods the system with adrenaline and other stress hormones. Pain perception can be dramatically reduced. Soldiers often report not noticing severe injuries until after combat ends. Strength can temporarily increase as normal safety limiters in the nervous system are overridden. Vision narrows to a tunnel focused on immediate threats. Time perception distorts. Complex thought becomes difficult, while instinctive, trained responses dominate. This is the berserker state, or part of it, but the description suggests something beyond ordinary combat adrenaline, something more extreme and more ritually constructed. The trembling and shaking suggest hyperventilation, which can alter blood chemistry and create dissociative states. The sensation of heat might result from extreme metabolic activity, combined with the suppression of normal temperature regulation. The animal sounds and shield biting could be learned behaviors, ritualized actions that helped trigger the psychological shift from normal consciousness to battle fury. Some berserkers were described as going through these manifestations before every battle, as though following a set script. Others seemed to enter the fury more unpredictably.
This suggests both a physiological component, a capacity for entering these states, and a psychological one, trained responses and ritual triggers. The duration of the fury varied. Some accounts describe it lasting for the entire battle, with the berserker fighting tirelessly for hours. Others suggest shorter bursts of intense activity, followed by exhaustion. The aftermath was consistently described as devastating. The warrior would collapse, sometimes unable to move for a day or more, falling into deep sleep or a stupor-like state. The Egil's saga describes the aftermath. When the fury left them, they were weaker than before, both in body and in spirit. This post-fury exhaustion is significant. It suggests a massive expenditure of physical and psychological resources, a burning through of energy reserves that left the warrior depleted. It also created a tactical vulnerability. A berserker immediately after battle was nearly helpless, dependent on his companions for protection. Some sources hint at darker aftermath effects: depression, irritability, difficulty controlling anger even in peaceful situations. The Vatnsdøla saga mentions berserkers who became dangerous to live with in peacetime, whose families feared them, who could not fully return to normal social relations after extended exposure to the fury. This raises profound questions. Was the berserker fury sustainable? Could a warrior enter this state repeatedly without permanent psychological damage? Or did berserkers have shortened careers, burning out after a certain number of times going berserk? The sources are not clear on this point, but it is notable that most named berserkers in the sagas die young, usually in battle, but sometimes in duels or through execution. We rarely hear of elderly berserkers living peaceful retirements. This might reflect historical reality, that the berserker path was inherently unsustainable, a role that consumed those who adopted it. But the fury itself, in the moment of battle, was undeniably effective. Berserkers terrified their enemies. The psychological impact of facing warriors who seemed to feel no pain, who fought with inhuman strength, who made animal sounds and appeared to be possessed by supernatural forces. This often broke enemy morale before the physical combat even began. The Vikings understood psychological warfare. They knew that fear was as powerful a weapon as any sword. The berserkers were weapons of terror as much as weapons of violence. Their reputation preceded them. Stories of their exploits spread. Enemies hearing that berserkers were present in the opposing force might flee or surrender rather than face them. This reputation was carefully cultivated and maintained. The rituals before battle, the howling, the shield biting, the displays of fury, served partly to prepare the berserker himself, but partly to demonstrate to enemies what they would face. It was theatre as well as preparation, performance as well as ritual. But it was not mere theatre. The violence that followed was real enough. When berserkers struck, they struck with devastating effect.
How did a warrior prepare to go berserk? What rituals and practices facilitated the transformation from normal human consciousness to the battle fury? The sources provide fragmentary glimpses rather than complete descriptions. This is partly because the sagas were written by Christian authors who had ambivalent attitudes toward pagan practices, and partly because such rituals were likely guarded secrets, taught within warrior groups and families, but not shared openly. What we can piece together suggests a complex system of physical, psychological, and spiritual preparation. Physical preparation began long before any specific battle. Berserkers were not simply ordinary warriors who occasionally went into frenzies. They were specialists who trained their bodies and minds from youth for this particular role. The training was extreme. The Haufs saga, or Haufsreka, describes young men being trained as berserkers through a regimen that included extended exposure to cold,
training to ignore pain through progressive desensitization, exercises in remaining still for long periods followed by explosive movement, practice in fighting while sleep-deprived or exhausted, and extensive weapons drilling until techniques became instinctive rather than conscious. The goal was to create warriors who could override normal human responses, who could function when body and mind were screaming to stop, who had trained their bodies so thoroughly that fighting became automatic even when rational thought was suppressed. Psychological preparation involved what modern military training calls stress inoculation. Systematic exposure to combat conditions until the initial panic response is replaced with trained reaction. But for berserkers, this seems to have gone beyond standard warrior training into something more ritualized and more extreme. Some sources mention isolation before important battles. The warrior would withdraw from his companions, perhaps into the forest, remaining alone with his thoughts, building the internal pressure that would fuel the coming fury. This isolation was not merely waiting, but active preparation. Meditation on battle, visualization of victory, internal chanting or prayer to Odin, conscious building of rage through remembered insults or perceived wrongs. The role of ritual substances remains one of the most debated aspects of berserker preparation. Did they use drugs to induce or enhance the fury? Several substances have been proposed by historians and archaeologists. The most famous is the Amanita muscaria mushroom, the red and white spotted toadstool that appears in fairy tales. This mushroom, common in Scandinavian forests, contains psychoactive compounds that can induce altered states of consciousness, feelings of enhanced strength, distorted perception, and aggressive behavior. Some scholars have argued that berserkers consumed these mushrooms before battle, that the fury was essentially a drug-induced psychotic break. The evidence, however, is largely circumstantial. No saga explicitly describes berserkers eating mushrooms. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age sites has not revealed concentrations of Amanita muscaria remains in contexts suggesting ritual use. Moreover, the effects of Amanita muscaria are somewhat unpredictable and include significant side effects: nausea, loss of coordination, confusion, that would be extremely counterproductive in combat. It seems unlikely that warriors would deliberately ingest a substance that might make them vomit and stumble in the moments before battle. Other substances have been proposed. Henbane, a plant that grows throughout Europe and contains hallucinogenic alkaloids, might have been used. Alcohol, especially consumed in large quantities quickly, could disinhibit and embolden warriors. Some scholars have suggested that a combination of substances, perhaps including alcohol, psychoactive plants, and other ingredients in specific preparations, might have been used. The truth is that we do not know with certainty. It is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that some berserkers used no substances at all, that the fury was achieved purely through psychological and physical techniques refined over years of training. What we can say is that if substances were used, they were probably part of a broader ritual context rather than the sole cause of the fury. The transformation was not simply chemical, but cultural, psychological, spiritual. The immediate pre-battle rituals are somewhat better documented. Multiple sources describe berserkers engaging in specific behaviors in the hours or minutes before combat began. Chanting was common. Not casual singing, but rhythmic, repetitive vocalizations that built in intensity. Some sources suggest these were prayers or invocations to Odin, calling on the god to grant his fury to his chosen warriors. Others describe wordless sounds, growls and howls that mimicked predatory animals. Drumming accompanied the chanting in some accounts. The steady rhythm would have physiological effects, heart rate synchronizing to the beat, breathing pattern affected. The sound creating a sonic environment that separated the warrior from ordinary consciousness. Movement was part of the ritual. Some accounts describe berserkers dancing before battle, not gracefully, but with violent, spasmodic movements that might have been designed to trigger hyperventilation and dissociative states. The dancing could last for extended periods, working the warrior into a state of exhaustion that paradoxically prepared him for the superhuman exertion to come. The biting of shields, mentioned in multiple sources, seems to have been both ritual and practical. The pressure of teeth on wood or metal rim, the slight pain, the aggressive gesture, all of these might have helped trigger the psychological shift. And the visible display demonstrated to allies and enemies alike that the transformation was beginning. Some berserkers wore specific clothing or ornaments during these rituals. Bear pelts, wolf skins, or cloaks marked with images of predatory animals. Necklaces of teeth and claws. Arm rings inscribed with runes invoking Odin's favor. These items were not mere decoration, but tools of transformation, physical objects that helped the warrior access the mental state required. The role of the group should not be underestimated. Berserkers seem often to have performed their pre-battle rituals together, feeding off each other's energy, building collective momentum. The presence of others entering the fury might have made it easier for individuals to achieve the state, creating a social and psychological pressure that facilitated the transformation. This group dynamic also served a practical purpose. If the fury was unstable, if there was a risk of it erupting at inappropriate times, having other berserkers present meant there were individuals who understood the state, who could potentially calm or restrain a warrior whose fury was misdirected. The question of how conscious the berserker was during the fury remains open. Some descriptions suggest complete loss of rational thought, a purely instinctive state where the warrior could not distinguish friend from enemy and would attack anything that moved. Other accounts show berserkers following complex battle plans, coordinating with other warriors, making tactical decisions that suggest at least some rational faculty remained. Likely, the reality varied by individual and circumstance. Some berserkers achieved deeper dissociative states than others. Some maintained more control. The fury was probably not a single, uniform experience, but a spectrum of altered states, all characterized by reduced pain perception, increased aggression, and diminished fear, but varying in the degree to which normal consciousness was suppressed. What is clear is that the transformation was real, that it was achieved through a combination of training, ritual, possibly substances, and psychological preparation, and that it produced warriors who were genuinely different in combat from even the bravest and most skilled ordinary fighters. The rituals were the gateway, the fury was the destination, and the battlefield was where the berserker's true purpose was fulfilled. What weapons did berserkers carry into battle? How did their choice of armament reflect their role and their method of fighting? The most consistent detail across the sources is what berserkers did not carry: shields and armor. The absence of armor is mentioned repeatedly. While elite Viking warriors typically wore mail shirts, expensive, effective protection consisting of thousands of interlocked iron rings, berserkers fought without this defense. They wore leather or cloth, bear or wolf pelts, but not metal armor. This choice was partly practical and partly symbolic. The practical reason: armor restricts movement and adds weight. A warrior in the extreme physical state of berserker fury, expending energy at an unsustainable rate, would overheat catastrophically in a heavy mail shirt. The lack of armor allowed for greater speed, more sustained exertion, and prevented heat stroke during the fury. The symbolic reason. To fight without armor was to demonstrate fearlessness, to show contempt for enemy weapons, to embody the bear or wolf who needs no artificial protection. It was a statement of confidence in the fury itself as protection. The gods would preserve their chosen warriors, and those destined to die would die regardless of male. This, of course, was not strictly true. Berserkers died in battle at rates probably higher than armored warriors. The lack of protection made them vulnerable. But the psychological impact of unarmored warriors charging into battle, apparently heedless of danger, was enormous. The shield question is more complex. Some sources state that berserkers fought without shields, relying purely on offense. Others describe them carrying shields but using them aggressively, as weapons to bash enemies, rather than defensively. Still others mention the shield-biting ritual, but then show berserkers dropping their shields before actual combat began. The most likely reality is that practice varied. Some berserkers fought with shields, some without, depending on the tactical situation, personal preference, and the depth of the fury. A warrior in a moderate state of rage might retain enough tactical sense to use a shield effectively. One in a complete frenzy probably could not. As for offensive weapons, berserkers showed a preference for certain types. The axe appears most frequently in accounts of berserker combat. Not the small hand axes that many warriors carried, but large two-handed battle axes, weapons that required space to swing and tremendous strength to wield effectively, but that could deliver devastating blows capable of cleaving through shields, helmets, and bodies. The famous Dane axe, with its broad, curved blade and long handle, was particularly associated with berserkers and other elite warriors. In skilled hands, wielded with fury-enhanced strength, such a weapon was terrifying. The archaeological record shows skulls split by axe blows, mail shirts torn open, bones shattered. The kind of catastrophic trauma that suggests extraordinary force behind the strike. Swords appear less frequently in specific berserker contexts, though berserkers certainly used them. The Viking Age sword was primarily a cutting weapon, designed for slashing attacks rather than thrusting. A good sword was expensive, often given a personal name, passed down through families, valued beyond its practical utility. For a berserker, a sword might have been less ideal than an axe. The sword required more technique, more finesse. The axe was more forgiving. Raw strength could compensate for imprecise technique. But some berserkers, those with years of training, could certainly wield swords with terrible effectiveness. Spears were common weapons throughout the Viking Age, but they appear less frequently in berserker descriptions. The spear was partly a ranged weapon, thrown before close combat began, and partly a weapon for disciplined formation fighting. Neither role suited the berserker approach, which emphasized closing quickly to personal combat and fighting as an individual champion, rather than as part of a shield wall. Some accounts mention berserkers using unconventional weapons, or no weapons at all. The Hafs saga describes berserkers tearing enemies apart with their bare hands, breaking necks and spines. The Grettis saga mentions a berserker who bit through an opponent's throat. These accounts are probably exaggerated, but they capture something true about the berserker ethos: that the fury itself was the weapon, that the tools of iron were secondary to the transformed state of the warrior. Certain weapons seem to have had ritual significance. A sword that had killed many enemies, an axe inherited from a famous berserker ancestor, a spear dedicated to Odin. These were more than tools. They were objects of power that connected the warrior to his lineage and his god. The inscription of runes on weapons was common among elite warriors. Runes were not merely an alphabet, but carried magical significance. A sword inscribed with runes invoking victory, protection, or Odin's blessing was thought to be more effective than an uninscribed blade. Some berserker weapons have survived, identifiable through their fine spot in clearly elite warrior graves, sometimes with associations to bear or wolf symbolism, often showing signs of extensive use, nicked edges, repairs, evidence of the combat they saw. One particularly interesting find from Norway included an axe that had been deliberately damaged and then carefully repaired multiple times. Each repair was done with skill, suggesting the axe was valued enough to preserve rather than replace. Chemical analysis of residue on the blade suggested it had been used to cut bone, human bone, repeatedly. This was a weapon that had seen extensive combat, that had been carried through many battles, that had perhaps accompanied a berserker through his entire career. The relationship between warrior and weapon was intimate in Viking culture. Weapons were given names: leg biter, mail coat's bane, life taker. They were characters in stories, celebrated in poetry, mourned when lost or broken. For a berserker, the weapon he carried into the fury was an extension of himself, a tool of his transformed state, nearly as important as his own body in the expression of his role. But the weapon was not the warrior. The fury was not dependent on any particular sword or axe. Stories tell of berserkers picking up whatever came to hand in battle, a fallen enemy's weapon, a piece of wood, a stone, and fighting on with undiminished effectiveness. Because the true weapon was the berserker himself. The physical tools simply focused and directed the fury that came from within, that flowed from Odin, that manifested the bear or wolf nature the warrior had taken on.
The written sources that preserve stories of berserkers are complex documents, and we must approach them carefully, understanding what they are and what they are not. The Icelandic sagas were written down mostly in the 13th and 14th centuries, several hundred years after the events they describe. They draw on oral traditions, on poems, on historical memory, but they are not contemporary accounts. They are literature as much as history, carefully crafted narratives that serve artistic and ideological purposes beyond simple factual recording. The saga authors were Christians, living in a Christianized society, looking back at a pagan past with mixed feelings. Nostalgia and condemnation, admiration and disapproval exist simultaneously in these texts. The berserkers are presented as both heroes and problems, both admirable warriors and dangerous throwbacks to a more savage age. Yet, for all their limitations, the sagas are our richest source of information about how berserkers were understood and remembered in Norse culture. They preserve details that ring true, that fit with archaeological evidence and with contemporary references from non-Scandinavian sources. They give us names, stories, specific incidents that help us understand what berserkers were and how they functioned. Let us examine some specific saga accounts and what they reveal. The Egil's saga, one of the most historically grounded of the Icelandic sagas, provides one of the fullest treatments of the berserker phenomenon through the character of Skallagrim and his father Kveldulf. Kveldulf, the name means evening wolf, was so called because he would become grim and hard to deal with in the evenings. The saga describes this as the Hamramr, shape strength, coming upon him. He would be dangerous to approach, unpredictable, potentially violent. This was not battle fury, but something chronic, a condition that affected him regularly. Skallagrim, Kveldulf's son and the father of the saga's protagonist, Egil, inherited this nature. The saga describes an incident where Skallagrim was playing a ball game with his young son Egil and other boys. Egil was losing and became angry. Then Skallagrim grew furious, seized him and dashed him to the ground so hard that he was left senseless. Another boy, trying to help Egil, was killed by Skallagrim, who dashed his head against a rock, and the boy died at once.
This happened in peacetime, during a game. Skallagrim's berserker nature erupted inappropriately, with tragic consequences. The saga presents this not as deliberate evil, but as a curse, an uncontrollable affliction that made Skallagrim dangerous to his own family. This darker presentation of berserker fury, as something that could not be fully controlled, that might erupt at any time, that made a man dangerous even to those he loved, appears in multiple sagas. It represents a problem with the berserker phenomenon that Viking Age society clearly recognized and struggled with. The Vatnsturla saga tells of two Swedish berserkers, Halli and Leiknir, who came to Iceland and terrorized the population. They would challenge men to duels, kill them, and take their property and women. This continued until they encountered Jökull Ingimundarson, who managed to kill both berserkers through trickery rather than direct combat. He challenged them to walk across a floor that he had secretly weakened, and they fell through into a pit where they were killed with spears. This story presents berserkers as villains, as dangers to orderly society that must be eliminated through cunning, since they cannot be defeated through honorable combat. It reflects a period when berserkers were being outlawed and hunted down, when they were no longer valued members of society, but relics of a more violent past. The Halfs saga, Åke Halfsreka, presents berserkers more heroically. King Halfr of Hordaland maintains a force of 12 champions, several of whom are identified as berserkers. They are his elite guard, his most trusted warriors, men who fight with him in his hall, until all of them die together when enemies burn the hall around them. These berserkers are presented as loyal, brave, and effective. When the fury comes upon them before battle, it is described in terms of divine blessing. They felt the strength of Odin in their arms, the fury in their hearts. They knew no fear. They cared nothing for wounds. The saga describes their deaths in battle with admiration and sadness. These were heroes, men whose loss was mourned, whose memory was honored. The Ynglinga saga, as we have mentioned before, attributes the origin of berserkers directly to Odin and his followers. His men went without coats of mail and were mad as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields and were as strong as bears or bulls. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron could hurt them. This is called going berserk. This passage presents the berserker state as a divine gift, something granted by Odin to his most favored warriors. The mention that neither fire nor iron could hurt them is clearly poetic exaggeration, but it captures how berserkers were perceived, as transcending normal human vulnerability through divine protection. The Grettir saga describes the outlaw Grettir encountering berserkers and noting their strange behavior before fighting. They would howl like animals, bite their shield rims, plunge into cold water, and sometimes fight each other before the actual battle began. This detail about fighting each other is particularly interesting. It suggests the fury, once triggered, was not easily controlled or directed. The berserkers might attack the nearest target, even if that was another berserker rather than an actual enemy. This lack of discrimination is both a strength and a weakness. It makes berserkers terrifying. They will attack anyone and anything. But it also makes them tactical liabilities in complex battle situations where distinguishing friend from foe is important. The Volsunga saga, one of the oldest and most mythological of the sagas, tells of Sigmund and his son, Sinfjotli, encountering men who could transform into wolves. They kill these men and take their wolf skins, which grant them the ability to transform as well. While wearing the skins, they cannot remove them, and they take on wolf nature. They can understand the speech of wolves, they feel compelled to hunt and kill, they speak only in wolf voices. This is clearly more mythological than the other accounts, but it captures the essential idea of the hamr, the taking on of animal nature through ritual means, the loss of human form and consciousness, the temporary becoming of something else. The saga describes Sigmund and Sinfjotli attacking groups of men while in wolf form, killing effortlessly. They fell upon men with such fury that none could stand against them. But then they fight each other, with Sigmund seriously wounding Sinfjotli before recognizing who he is attacking. Again, we see this theme of the fury being indiscriminate, of the transformation being dangerous even to those close to the transformed warrior. These saga accounts, taken together, paint a complex picture. Berserkers were elite warriors, divinely blessed, capable of extraordinary feats in battle. They were also dangerous, unstable, difficult to control, potentially violent toward their own people. They were honored and feared, valued and problematic, heroes and threats. The sagas preserve the memory of real berserkers, real incidents, real social tensions around these warriors. But they also mythologize, dramatize, and interpret according to the values of the Christian era in which they were written. We must read them carefully, looking for the historical reality beneath the literary artistry.
Chapter 7. Weapons of the Frenzied.
What weapons did berserkers carry into battle? How did their choice of armament reflect their role and their method of fighting? The most consistent detail across the sources is what berserkers did not carry: shields and armor. The absence of armor is mentioned repeatedly. While elite Viking warriors typically wore mail shirts, expensive, effective protection consisting of thousands of interlocked iron rings, berserkers fought without this defense. They wore leather or cloth, bear or wolf pelts, but not metal armor. This choice was partly practical and partly symbolic. The practical reason: armor restricts movement and adds weight. A warrior in the extreme physical state of berserker fury, expending energy at an unsustainable rate, would overheat catastrophically in a heavy mail shirt. The lack of armor allowed for greater speed, more sustained exertion, and prevented heat stroke during the fury. The symbolic reason: to fight without armor was to demonstrate fearlessness, to show contempt for enemy weapons, to embody the bear or wolf who needs no artificial protection. It was a statement of confidence in the fury itself as protection. The gods would preserve their chosen warriors, and those destined to die would die regardless of mail. This, of course, was not strictly true. Berserkers died in battle at rates probably higher than armored warriors. The lack of protection made them vulnerable. But the psychological impact of unarmored warriors charging into battle, apparently heedless of danger, was enormous. The shield question is more complex. Some sources state that berserkers fought without shields, relying purely on offense. Others describe them carrying shields, but using them aggressively as weapons to bash enemies rather than defensively. Still others mention the shield-biting ritual, but then show berserkers dropping their shields before actual combat began. The most likely reality is that practice varied. Some berserkers fought with shields, some without, depending on the tactical situation, personal preference, and the depth of the fury. A warrior in a moderate state of rage might retain enough tactical sense to use a shield effectively. One in a complete frenzy probably could not. As for offensive weapons, berserkers showed a preference for certain types. The axe appears most frequently in accounts of berserker combat. Not the small hand axes that many warriors carried, but large, two-handed battle axes, weapons that required space to swing and tremendous strength to wield effectively, but that could deliver devastating blows capable of cleaving through shields, helmets, and bodies.
The famous Dane axe, with its broad, curved blade and long handle, was particularly associated with berserkers and other elite warriors.
In skilled hands, wielded with fury-enhanced strength, such a weapon was terrifying. The archaeological record shows skulls split by axe blows, mail shirts torn open, bones shattered, the kind of catastrophic trauma that suggests extraordinary force behind the strike. Swords appear less frequently in specific berserker contexts, though berserkers certainly used them. The Viking Age sword was primarily a cutting weapon, designed for slashing attacks rather than thrusting. A good sword was expensive, often given a personal name, passed down through families, valued beyond its practical utility. For a berserker, a sword might have been less ideal than an axe. The sword required more technique, more finesse. The axe was more forgiving. Raw strength could compensate for imprecise technique. But some berserkers, those with years of training, could certainly wield swords with terrible effectiveness. Spears were common weapons throughout the Viking Age, but they appear less frequently in berserker descriptions. The spear was partly a ranged weapon, thrown before close combat began, and partly a weapon for disciplined formation fighting. Neither role suited the berserker approach, which emphasized closing quickly to personal combat and fighting as an individual champion rather than as part of a shield wall. Some accounts mention berserkers using unconventional weapons, or no weapons at all. The Hafs saga describes berserkers tearing enemies apart with their bare hands, breaking necks and spines. The Grettis saga mentions a berserker who bit through an opponent's throat. These accounts are probably exaggerated, but they capture something true about the berserker ethos: that the fury itself was the weapon, that the tools of iron were secondary to the transformed state of the warrior. Certain weapons seem to have had ritual significance. A sword that had killed many enemies, an axe inherited from a famous berserker ancestor, a spear dedicated to Odin. These were more than tools. They were objects of power that connected the warrior to his lineage and his god. The inscription of runes on weapons was common among elite warriors. Runes were not merely an alphabet, but carried magical significance. A sword inscribed with runes invoking victory, protection, or Odin's blessing was thought to be more effective than an uninscribed blade. Some berserker weapons have survived, identifiable through their find spot in clearly elite warrior graves, sometimes with associations to bear or wolf symbolism, often showing signs of extensive use, nicked edges, repairs, evidence of the combat they saw. One particularly interesting find from Norway included an axe that had been deliberately damaged and then carefully repaired multiple times. Each repair was done with skill, suggesting the axe was valued enough to preserve rather than replace. Chemical analysis of residue on the blade suggested it had been used to cut bone, human bone, repeatedly. This was a weapon that had seen extensive combat, that had been carried through many battles, that had perhaps accompanied a berserker through his entire career. The relationship between warrior and weapon was intimate in Viking culture. Weapons were given names: leg-biter, mailcoat's bane, life-taker. They were characters in stories, celebrated in poetry, mourned when lost or broken. For a berserker, the weapon he carried into the fury was an extension of himself, a tool of his transformed state, nearly as important as his own body in the expression of his role. But the weapon was not the warrior. The fury was not dependent on any particular sword or axe. Stories tell of berserkers picking up whatever came to hand in battle: a fallen enemy's weapon, a piece of wood, a stone, and fighting on with undiminished effectiveness. Because the true weapon was the berserker himself. The physical tools simply focused and directed the fury that came from within, that flowed from Odin, that manifested the bear or wolf nature the warrior had taken on. Chapter 8. The Sagas Speak. The written sources that preserve stories of berserkers are complex documents, and we must approach them carefully, understanding what they are and what they are not. The Icelandic sagas were written down mostly in the 13th and 14th centuries, several hundred years after the events they describe. They draw on oral traditions, on poems, on historical memory, but they are not contemporary accounts. They are literature as much as history, carefully crafted narratives that serve artistic and ideological purposes beyond simple factual recording. The saga authors were Christians, living in a Christianized society, looking back at a pagan past with mixed feelings. Nostalgia and condemnation, admiration and disapproval exist simultaneously in these texts. The berserkers are presented as both heroes and problems, both admirable warriors and dangerous throwbacks to a more savage age. Yet for all their limitations, the sagas are our richest source of information about how berserkers were understood and remembered in Norse culture. They preserve details that ring true, that fit with archaeological evidence and with contemporary references from non-Scandinavian sources. They give us names, stories, specific incidents that help us understand what berserkers were and how they functioned. Let us examine some specific saga accounts and what they reveal. The Eagle's saga, one of the most historically grounded of the Icelandic sagas, provides one of the fullest treatments of the berserker phenomenon through the character of Skallagrim and his father, Kveldulf. Kveldulf, the name means evening wolf, was so called because he would become grim and hard to deal with in the evenings. The saga describes this as the hamramr, shape strength, coming upon him. He would be dangerous to approach, unpredictable, potentially violent. This was not battle fury, but something chronic, a condition that affected him regularly. Skallagrim, Kveldulf's son and the father of the saga's protagonist, Eagle, inherited this nature. The saga describes an incident where Skallagrim was playing a ball game with his young son Eagle and other boys. Eagle was losing and became angry. Then Skallagrim grew furious, seized him, and dashed him to the ground so hard that he was left senseless. Another boy, trying to help Eagle, was killed by Skallagrim, who dashed his head against a rock, and the boy died at once. This happened in peacetime, during a game. Skallagrim's berserker nature erupted inappropriately, with tragic consequences. The saga presents this not as deliberate evil, but as a curse, an uncontrollable affliction that made Skallagrim dangerous to his own family. This darker presentation of berserker fury, as something that could not be fully controlled, that might erupt at any time, that made a man dangerous even to those he loved, appears in multiple sagas. It represents a problem with the berserker phenomenon that Viking Age society clearly recognized and struggled with. The Vatnsdöla saga tells of two Swedish berserkers, Halli and Leiknir, who came to Iceland and terrorized the population. They would challenge men to duels, kill them, and take their property and women. This continued until they encountered Jökull Ingimundarson, who managed to kill both berserkers through trickery rather than direct combat. He challenged them to walk across a floor that he had secretly weakened, and they fell through into a pit where they were killed with spears. This story presents berserkers as villains, as dangers to orderly society that must be eliminated through cunning, since they cannot be defeated through honorable combat. It reflects a period when berserkers were being outlawed and hunted down, when they were no longer valued members of society, but relics of a more violent past. The Haufs saga, Oka Haufsreka, presents berserkers more heroically. King Halfr of Hordaland maintains a force of 12 champions, several of whom are identified as berserkers. They are his elite guard, his most trusted warriors, men who fight with him in his hall until all of them die together when enemies burn the hall around them. These berserkers are presented as loyal, brave, and effective. When the fury comes upon them before battle, it is described in terms of divine blessing. They felt the strength of Odin in their arms, the fury in their hearts. They knew no fear. They cared nothing for wounds. The saga describes their deaths in battle with admiration and sadness. These were heroes, men whose loss was mourned, whose memory was honored. The Ynglinga saga, as we have mentioned before, attributes the origin of berserkers directly to Odin and his followers. His men went without coats of mail and were mad as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields and were as strong as bears or bulls. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron could hurt them. This is called going berserk. This passage presents the berserker state as a divine gift, something granted by Odin to his most favored warriors. The mention that neither fire nor iron could hurt them is clearly poetic exaggeration, but it captures how berserkers were perceived, as transcending normal human vulnerability through divine protection. The Grettis saga describes the outlaw Grettir encountering berserkers and noting their strange behavior before fighting. They would howl like animals, bite their shield rims, plunge into cold water, and sometimes fight each other before the actual battle began. This detail about fighting each other is particularly interesting. It suggests the fury, once triggered, was not easily controlled or directed. The berserkers might attack the nearest target, even if that was another berserker rather than an actual enemy. This lack of discrimination is both a strength and a weakness. It makes berserkers terrifying. They will attack anyone and anything. But it also makes them tactical liabilities in complex battle situations, where distinguishing friend from foe is important. The Vosunga saga, one of the oldest and most mythological of the sagas, tells of Sigmund and his son Sinfjotli encountering men who could transform into wolves.
They kill these men and take their wolf skins, which grant them the ability to transform as well. While wearing the skins, they cannot remove them, and they take on wolf nature. They can understand the speech of wolves. They feel compelled to hunt and kill. They speak only in wolf voices. This is clearly more mythological than the other accounts, but it captures the essential idea of the Hamr, the taking on of animal nature through ritual means, the loss of human form and consciousness, the temporary becoming of something else. The saga describes Sigmund and Sinfjotli attacking groups of men while in wolf form, killing effortlessly. They fell upon men with such fury that none could stand against them. But then they fight each other, with Sigmund seriously wounding Sinfjotli before recognizing who he is attacking. Again, we see this theme of the fury being indiscriminate, of the transformation being dangerous even to those close to the transformed warrior. These saga accounts, taken together, paint a complex picture. Berserkers were elite warriors, divinely blessed, capable of extraordinary feats in battle. They were also dangerous, unstable, difficult to control, potentially violent toward their own people. They were honored and feared, valued and problematic, heroes and threats. The sagas preserve the memory of real berserkers, real incidents, real social tensions around these warriors. But they also mythologize, dramatize, and interpret according to the values of the Christian era in which they were written. We must read them carefully, looking for the historical reality beneath the literary artistry.
Chapter 9. Berserkers in Battle. Let us now imagine a specific battle, drawing on saga descriptions and archaeological evidence to reconstruct what a berserker's combat experience might have been like. The year is 934 CE. The place is somewhere in Norway. Two petty kings, rivals for control of a strategically important valley, have gathered their forces. Each commands perhaps 300 to 400 warriors, farmers and craftsmen who owe military service to their lord, equipped with spears and shields, wearing leather or padded cloth armor, brave enough but not professional soldiers. Among one army are a dozen berserkers,
sworn to the king's service, identified by the bear and wolf pelts they wear over their shoulders. They stand slightly apart from the main force, preparing themselves. The armies have been visible to each other since dawn, arrayed on opposite sides of a large field. The actual fighting has not yet begun. There are rituals to observe, challenges to make, last attempts at negotiation that will fail. The waiting is almost worse than the violence will be. The slow build of tension, the fear in the gut, the terrible anticipation. The berserkers have been preparing since before dawn. They gathered away from the main camp, building a fire, beginning their chants. The rhythmic singing has continued for hours now, building gradually in intensity. They have drunk something, perhaps ale, perhaps something more potent, perhaps nothing but cold water. The content matters less than the ritual of drinking together, of sharing the moment before transformation. They move now, not gracefully, but with increasing violence of motion. They strike their weapons together, the ringing of metal on metal providing percussion to their chants. They bite the edges of their shields, leaving tooth marks in wood and leather. Some begin to tremble, their bodies shaking as though gripped by fever. The other warriors watch with mixture of awe and unease. They are glad the berserkers are on their side, but they give them space. Everyone knows that when the fury fully arrives, the berserkers will be dangerous to anyone nearby. The enemy across the field has noticed the commotion. They can hear the howling now, animal sounds that should not come from human throats. They can see the violent movements, the signs that the bear warriors are preparing. Fear begins to spread through their ranks. Some men edge backward. Their king shouts encouragement, threatens, tries to hold his force together. The berserkers are shedding their cloaks now, stripping down despite the cold morning.
Steam rises from their exposed skin. They are burning so hot that the cold air feels like nothing, that their bodies seem to be on fire internally. Their eyes have changed, pupils dilated, gaze fixed and wild, seeing but not seeing in any normal sense. One of them, his name is Ulf, and he has gone berserk in 17 previous battles and survived them all, feels the familiar sensation overtaking him. His vision narrows. The sounds of the battlefield become distant, as though heard through water. His heart hammers in his chest, so hard he can hear it, feel it in his temples. His muscles tremble with the need for violence, for release. The signal comes. The king gives the order. The main forces begin to advance, shield walls forming, spears leveled. But the berserkers do not wait for orders. The fury is upon them fully now, and they cannot be held back. They charge. Not in formation, not with discipline, but as individuals, each carried forward by his own fury. They sprint across the field, covering ground with terrible speed, weapons raised, howling. To the enemy warriors watching them come, it must seem like demons are attacking, like something from nightmare made flesh. The enemy shield wall holds, barely. Spears thrust forward, trying to stop the charge. One berserker is hit, a spear taking him through the chest. He does not fall. He grabs the spear shaft, pulls himself along it toward the man who holds it, closes the distance, and kills the spearman with his axe before finally collapsing. The others crash into the shield wall like a storm wave hitting a seawall. Ulf swings his two-handed axe with strength that should not be possible. The blade catches a shield, splits it, continues through to the man behind. The shock of impact travels up Ulf's arms, but there is no pain, only the satisfaction of striking home, the need to strike again. He feels blows landing on him, a spear thrust that opens a gash along his ribs, a sword cut across his shoulder. Later, he will find these wounds, and they will pain him terribly. Now, in the fury, they are nothing.
His body is reporting only what matters. Enemies ahead. Kill, kill, kill. The enemy line is breaking. Not because the berserkers have killed that many men, there are only a dozen of them against hundreds, but because no one can stand in front of them. Warriors trained to hold their position in the shield wall, to fight as part of a unit, cannot maintain discipline when facing something that seems inhuman, that ignores wounds that would drop ordinary men, that fights with such ferocity that staying in its path means certain death. The line fragments. Once men begin to run, others follow. The shield wall dissolves into individual warriors trying to escape. And now the main force, the ordinary warriors who have been advancing steadily behind the berserkers, accelerates into a full charge. What the berserkers began, they will finish. The battle becomes a slaughter. Fleeing men are cut down from behind. Some throw down their weapons and beg for mercy. Some die fighting, brave but doomed. The king who led them tries to rally a defense around himself and his personal guard, but it is too late. The momentum of defeat cannot be reversed. Ulf is still fighting, still in the fury, but it is beginning to leave him. The sharpness of vision is returning. He becomes aware of his wounds. Oh gods, the pain. He has killed 6 men that he can remember clearly, probably more in the initial chaos that he cannot remember at all. His axe is notched and blood slicked. His body is covered in cuts, bruises, the splatter of other men's blood. He drops to his knees, suddenly unable to stand. The energy that carried him through the battle is gone, used up, leaving him hollow and weak. Other warriors are celebrating around him, looting the dead, taking weapons and valuables. Ulf cannot celebrate. He can barely move. The fury has left him, and in its place is only exhaustion and pain. His companions will have to help him back to camp, will have to tend his wounds, will have to feed him and guard him while he recovers. For the next day, perhaps 2 days, he will be nearly helpless. This is the cost of the fury. It takes as much as it gives. But he is alive. He has survived another battle. 17 become 18. And when he has recovered, when the wounds have healed and the strength has returned, he will go berserk again. Because this is what he is. This is his purpose. This is the gift and the curse that Odin has given him. Chapter 10. The King's Guardians. The most famous employment of berserkers in Viking Age society was as elite bodyguards to kings and powerful jarls. King Harald Fairhair of Norway, who ruled from approximately 872 to 930 CE and is credited with unifying much of Norway under his rule, maintained a permanent force of berserkers as his personal guard. The sources mention that these were carefully selected warriors, the fiercest and most skilled, who lived in Harald's hall, ate at his table, and received gifts of gold, weapons, and land in exchange for their service and loyalty. This was a significant evolution from berserkers as individual warriors or small groups serving temporarily with various forces. Under Harald and other powerful rulers, berserkers became institutionalized, incorporated into the formal structure of royal power. The arrangement benefited both parties. For the king, having berserkers as bodyguards provided security that went beyond mere numbers. Who would dare attack a ruler guarded by warriors known to feel no fear, to fight with inhuman strength, to be blessed by Odin himself? The psychological deterrent was enormous. Moreover, berserkers were useful for specific tactical situations. When a conventional assault was failing, send in the berserkers to break through. When a champion from an enemy force issued a challenge that ordinary warriors feared to accept, send a berserker to answer it. When intimidation was required, during negotiations, during enforcement of the king's will. The presence of berserkers made the threat of violence more credible. For the berserkers, royal service provided stability and prosperity that independent warrior life could not match. Instead of selling their services battle by battle, they had permanent employment, regular pay, honor, and social position. They were no longer marginal figures, but members of the king's inner circle, men of status and importance. But the arrangement also created tensions. Berserkers were dangerous, unpredictable. A warrior who might go into uncontrolled fury was a constant risk within the close confines of a royal hall. The sources mention protocols developed to manage this risk. Certain areas of the hall that berserkers were expected to avoid when the fury signs appeared. Rituals for calming them. The practice of assigning other warriors specifically to watch berserkers and intervene if they showed signs of inappropriate violence. The Hrafnsmal describes Harald's berserkers as occupying a specific place in his hall, sitting together, somewhat separated from ordinary retainers.
This physical separation may reflect social separation as well. The berserkers formed their own brotherhood within the larger household, bound more closely to each other than to others in the king's service. This brotherhood was important psychologically. Men who shared the experience of going berserk, who understood what it felt like and what it cost, could support each other in ways that others could not. They could recognize when one of their number was struggling with the fury in inappropriate circumstances and could help manage it. They could share techniques for triggering and controlling the state. They formed their own culture within the broader warrior culture. Kings in Denmark and Sweden maintained similar berserker guards. The Swedish king, Erik the Victorious, who ruled in the late 10th century, was described as having 12 berserkers who feared nothing and whom nothing could harm. The number 12 appears in multiple sources, suggesting it may have had ritual significance. 12 berserkers, like the 12 companions of mythological heroes, like the sacred numbers that appear throughout Norse culture. These royal berserkers accompanied kings on campaigns, fought in major battles, and sometimes undertook special missions, assassinations, terror raids, the elimination of threats to royal power. They were special forces in the most literal sense. Warriors deployed when ordinary forces were insufficient. But as Christianity spread through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, the relationship between kings and berserkers became more complicated. Christian kings had ambivalent feelings about warriors whose power derived from pagan religious practices, who were associated with Odin, who represented values and behaviors that Christian morality condemned. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who converted to Christianity around 965 CE, reportedly disbanded his berserker guard, or significantly reduced it. His son, Sweyn Forkbeard, reinstated berserkers in royal service, suggesting political and military considerations outweighed religious concerns. But the trend was clear. As Scandinavia Christianized, berserkers became increasingly problematic. Some kings attempted to Christianize the berserker tradition, reframing the battle fury not as Odinic blessing, but as divine inspiration from the Christian God. Not as taking on animal hammer, but as righteous wrath in service of a Christian king. Whether this theological reframing satisfied the berserkers themselves is questionable. By the mid-11th century, royal berserker guards were disappearing. The psychological impact of facing berserkers often broke enemy formations before any physical combat occurred. Men who might have stood firm against ordinary warriors fled before berserkers. Units that could have fought effectively instead dissolved into panic. This was not cowardice in any simple sense. It was a rational calculation of odds. To stand before a berserker charge was probably to die. To run was possibly to survive. When your purpose in battle is to return home to your farm and family, when you are not seeking glory or a death in combat,
When you are fighting because you were compelled to, rather than from choice, running makes sense. The Norse understood this psychology perfectly. That is why small numbers of berserkers could have disproportionate impact. A dozen berserkers might break a shield wall of hundreds of men, not because they killed everyone, but because their reputation and their fury-driven charge created panic that spread through the enemy force. But reputation was a double-edged weapon. Once established, it had to be maintained. A berserker who failed to live up to reputation, who was seen to feel fear or pain, who was defeated in combat, such a warrior lost not just the specific fight, but his entire identity. His power had always been partly psychological, partly based on belief, his own belief in his fury and others' belief in his invincibility. Once that belief shattered, it could not be easily restored. This created pressure on berserkers to constantly prove themselves, to take greater risks, to fight more fiercely. It may explain why so many berserker careers ended in death rather than retirement. They could not afford to show weakness, could not afford to decline the challenge or avoid the battle, because to do so would unmake them. The sagas preserve stories of berserker reputations being challenged and defended. The Grettis saga tells of a berserker named Thorir, who was known throughout Iceland for his ferocity. Warriors would travel long distances to challenge him, hoping to make their own reputations by defeating him. Thorir fought and killed multiple challengers before finally being defeated through trickery rather than direct combat. These challenge fights, Holmganga in Old Norse, literally going to the island, because such duels were often fought on small islands or other confined spaces to prevent escape, were integral to warrior culture and particularly important to berserkers. A Holmganga had formal rules. It was fought on defined ground, usually about 3 or 4 meters square. Each fighter had 3 shields. When all shields were broken, the fight could end by agreement.
First blood could end the fight, or it could continue to death, depending on what was agreed beforehand. There were witnesses to ensure rules were followed. Berserkers were famous for fighting Holmganga, often as champions for others. A wealthy man challenged to a duel by someone seeking to take his property might hire a berserker to fight in his place. The berserker would take payment, usually a percentage of whatever was being disputed, and would fight the duel. This was legal and accepted practice in Viking Age society, but as society became more orderly and centralized, as Christian law codes replaced older customs, the Holmganga began to be seen as problematic. It allowed resolution of disputes through violence rather than law. It gave advantages to those who could afford to hire berserkers. It perpetuated the very warrior culture that Christianity and centralized monarchy were trying to move beyond. In 1006 CE, Iceland outlawed the Holmganga. Norway followed within a few decades. Denmark and Sweden enacted similar prohibitions. Without the Holmganga, one avenue for berserker employment and reputation building closed. But reputation persisted beyond the end of the Viking Age. Even centuries later, the memory of berserkers shaped how Scandinavians were perceived. English chroniclers in the 12th and 13th centuries, writing about events long past, still mentioned the berserkers as exemplifying Norse ferocity. The word itself entered other languages as a term for uncontrolled rage. To go berserk means the same thing in English today that berserksganga meant in Old Norse 1,000 years ago. The berserkers achieved a kind of immortality through fear, through the stories told about them, through the reputation that outlasted the warriors themselves by centuries.
Chapter 12. The Chemical Question. Modern scholars, attempting to explain the berserker fury, have focused considerable attention on the possibility of drug use. Could the altered state have been chemically induced? We have mentioned the Amanita muscaria mushroom, the red and white spotted toadstool that contains psychoactive compounds. This has been the most discussed candidate for a berserker drug,
proposed initially in the late 19th century and repeated in countless books since. The theory is appealing. Amanita muscaria grows throughout Scandinavian forests, particularly in association with birch trees. It was known to have powerful effects on consciousness. Indigenous Siberian peoples used it in shamanic rituals, and some of its effects, distorted perception, feelings of enhanced strength, aggressive behavior, seem consistent with descriptions of berserker fury. But the evidence for berserkers actually using Amanita muscaria is remarkably thin. No saga explicitly mentions it. No archaeological context suggests ritual use of these mushrooms in Viking Age Scandinavia. And the problematic side effects, nausea, loss of coordination, inability to distinguish reality from hallucination, would be extraordinarily counterproductive in combat. A warrior who had eaten Amanita muscaria would certainly be in an altered state, but he would probably be vomiting, stumbling, confused, and unable to effectively wield weapons. This does not match the descriptions of berserkers as terrifyingly effective fighters. Some proponents of the mushroom theory have suggested that careful dosing could produce the desired effects while minimizing side effects, or that the mushrooms could be prepared in ways that reduced toxicity while preserving psychoactive properties. But this is speculation, not supported by direct evidence. Other psychoactive substances have been proposed. Henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, grows in Scandinavia and contains tropane alkaloids that can cause aggression, delirium, and reduced pain perception. Black henbane was known to Norse culture. It appears in Old Norse under the name henbana and was used medicinally. Henbane intoxication produces symptoms that might match some berserker descriptions: dilated pupils, flushed skin, increased heart rate, aggressive behavior, reduced sensitivity to pain. But again, it also produces severe side effects: blurred vision, inability to coordinate movements, confusion, inability to distinguish friend from foe. Would Viking Age warriors have used a substance that made them unable to see clearly or coordinate their attacks? It seems unlikely.
Alcohol has been suggested as either the sole agent or part of a multi-substance mixture. Heavy alcohol consumption can certainly disinhibit aggression and reduce pain perception. The Norse consumed significant amounts of mead and ale, and ritual drinking before battle was common across many warrior cultures. But alcohol also impairs judgment, coordination, and strength. Heavily intoxicated warriors are not more effective fighters, they are less effective. The berserkers were described as fighting with enhanced ability, not diminished. Could moderate alcohol combined with other substances produce something closer to the described effects? Perhaps. But we are now in the realm of pure speculation, constructing hypothetical drug cocktails with no direct evidence that any such mixtures were used. Some scholars have pointed to more exotic possibilities. Bog myrtle, Myrica gale, used in medieval brewing, has mild psychoactive properties. Various hallucinogenic plants grow in Northern Europe. Preparations made from animal parts, bear or wolf brain tissue, for instance, might have contained psychoactive compounds. But for all of these, we face the same problem. No direct evidence in the sources, no archaeological confirmation, only speculation based on what might have been possible. The most radical reinterpretation of the chemical question suggests that the entire drug hypothesis may be unnecessary and misleading. The human body can produce its own altered states without external substances. Modern understanding of combat psychology recognizes that extreme stress can trigger profound physiological changes. The fight or flight response floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol. Heart rate increases dramatically. Blood flow shifts from internal organs to muscles. Pain perception is reduced through endogenous opioids, the body's own painkillers. Vision narrows. Time perception distorts. Strength temporarily increases as normal safety limiters are overridden. In extreme cases, stress can trigger dissociative states where normal consciousness fragments, where the person feels disconnected from their body, where actions become automatic and mechanical. This is not supernatural or chemically induced. It is the human nervous system responding to life-threatening situations. Could berserkers have achieved their fury through purely psychological and physiological means, without any drugs at all? Many modern scholars believe so. The ritual preparations, the chanting, drumming, hyperventilation, violent movements, could trigger stress responses severe enough to create the altered state.
The training from youth could teach warriors how to enter this state deliberately, rather than waiting for it to happen spontaneously. Think of modern combat sports, where fighters learn to enter a zone of heightened performance, where pain is ignored and normal caution is overridden. Or consider the documented cases of soldiers in modern warfare displaying seemingly impossible feats, carrying wounded comrades despite their own injuries, continuing to fight after sustaining wounds that should have been incapacitating, displaying strength and endurance far beyond their normal capacity. These are all achieved without drugs, through the body's own response to extreme stress, combined with training and psychological conditioning. The berserkers may have been warriors who had mastered this natural process, who could trigger it deliberately through ritual and mental preparation, who had trained themselves to function effectively even while in this altered state. If substances were used, and they may have been, they were probably secondary, helping to initiate the process, but not solely responsible for the fury itself. The berserker transformation was primarily a psychological and physiological phenomenon, rooted in human biology and trained through years of practice. But we cannot be certain. The evidence does not allow definitive conclusions. What we can say is that the berserker fury was real, that it was achieved through some combination of training, ritual, psychological preparation, and possibly substances, and that it produced warriors who were genuinely different in combat from ordinary fighters. The mystery endures, as perhaps it should. Some aspects of the past resist complete explanation, remaining at the edges of our understanding, fascinating precisely because they cannot be fully known. Chapter 13. Outlaws and Outcasts. As Viking Age society evolved, as Christianity spread, as centralized law replaced older customs, the berserker's position changed dramatically. What had once been honored became problematic. What had been sacred became dangerous. What had been a valued role became a social liability. The process was gradual, occurring over the course of the 11th century, but the trajectory was clear. Berserkers were being pushed to the margins of society, redefined from elite warriors to outlaws and outcasts. Multiple factors drove this transformation. Christian morality condemned the berserker tradition at its roots. The fury was pagan, associated with Odin, achieved through practices that Christians defined as demonic. The violence was excessive by Christian standards, the lack of control abhorrent, the animal nature blasphemous. A Christian warrior was supposed to fight with discipline and purpose, not with uncontrolled rage. He was supposed to be civilized, human, distinct from animals. The berserkers represented everything Christianity opposed in Norse culture: pagan religious practice, glorification of violence, the warrior ethos that valued courage above mercy, the idea that transformation into animal states was desirable. As Christianity became the official religion of Scandinavian kingdoms, as Christian law codes were implemented,
berserkers found themselves increasingly at odds with legal and moral authority. Laws specifically targeting berserkers began to appear. The Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code compiled in the 12th century, but reflecting earlier traditions, contains provisions against those who go berserk, defining it as a criminal act punishable by outlawry. To be outlawed in Viking Age and medieval Scandinavian society was severe punishment. The outlaw had no legal protection. He could be killed by anyone without penalty, his property could be seized, his family could be forced to disown him. He became, legally, a non-person, outside the bounds of society and law. That the law codes felt it necessary to explicitly criminalize going berserk suggests it was still occurring in the 11th and 12th centuries, but now in contexts society found unacceptable, probably private violence, feuds, disruption of the social order that Christian kings were trying to establish. The end of the Holmganga, the ritual duel that had provided berserkers with legal employment and a means of maintaining reputation, was particularly significant. Without this outlet, berserkers who had trained for combat had fewer productive uses for their skills.
Some became mercenaries, selling their services to any who would pay, traveling to conflicts in England, Ireland, continental Europe, even to the Byzantine Empire, where Norse warriors served in the Varangian Guard. But mercenary service was less prestigious than royal service had been, and it took berserkers away from their home societies, further marginalizing them. Others became outlaws, in fact, as well as law, living in forests and mountains, raiding isolated farms, becoming the bandits and dangerous men that saga heroes would hunt down. The transition from honored warrior to hunted criminal must have been psychologically devastating for men whose entire identity was bound up in their berserker status. The Grettis saga preserves the story of such outlaws. Grettir himself, though not specifically identified as a berserker, displays many berserker characteristics: extraordinary strength, tendency toward violence he cannot fully control, isolation from society. He spends the last years of his life as an outlaw, hunted, unable to reintegrate into society despite his abilities. The saga presents this as tragic, a capable man destroyed by a combination of his own nature and society's rejection. This may reflect how actual berserkers were perceived in the late Viking Age and early medieval period. Dangerous men who could not adapt to changing society, whose skills were no longer valued, who became problems to be eliminated rather than assets to be employed. Some berserkers may have retreated to the margins physically as well as socially, living in remote areas where old ways persisted longer, where Christian influence was weaker, where a man could still live by the warrior code and find at least tolerance, if not honor. But these refuges were temporary. Christian law and royal authority spread to even the remotest valleys. By the mid-12th century, there were no longer pagan spaces in Scandinavia where berserkers could exist in their old role. The last references to actual berserkers, as opposed to nostalgic mentions in sagas written about earlier times, date to approximately 1100 to 1150 CE. After that, the berserker became primarily a figure of literature and memory rather than social reality. But the memory was powerful. The sagas, most written in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after berserkers had disappeared, still devoted significant attention to them. Writers clearly found them fascinating, powerful symbols of a pagan past that was both admired and condemned. This ambivalence, the simultaneous fascination and moral condemnation, would persist down through centuries. The berserkers would be remembered, mythologized, reinterpreted by each era according to its own concerns and values. They had lived as warriors, they died as outlaws, and they endured as legends. Chapter 14. Christianity's Shadow.
The coming of Christianity to Scandinavia was not a single event, but a gradual process spanning centuries, proceeding at different rates in different regions, resisted in some areas and embraced in others. The conversion officially began in Denmark in the mid-10th century under King Harald Bluetooth. Norway followed under Olaf Tryggvason in the late 10th century and Olaf Haraldsson in the early 11th. Sweden was the last, with Christianity not fully established until the 12th century. Iceland converted officially in the year 1000 CE, though pagan practices persisted unofficially for generations afterward. For the berserkers, Christianity represented existential threat. Their entire identity was rooted in practices and beliefs the new religion condemned. The fury was Odinic, a gift from the god of warriors. But Christianity recognized only one god, and Odin was redefined as a demon, a false god, perhaps Satan himself in disguise. To call upon Odin, to seek his blessing, was now not devotion but heresy, not religion but devil worship. The transformation into animal nature, the taking on of the bear or wolf hammer, was likewise reinterpreted through Christian categories. Where Norse paganism saw this as spiritual achievement, Christianity saw demonic possession. A man who became like an animal, who lost his human nature and reason, was not blessed, but cursed, not elevated, but degraded. The Christian virtue system valued completely different qualities than the warrior culture. Humility over pride, mercy over vengeance, forgiveness over honor, peace over martial prowess. The ideal Christian was not the fearless warrior who died gloriously in battle, but the suffering servant who turned the other cheek, who accepted persecution, who valued spiritual victory over worldly success. This was fundamentally incompatible with berserker values. A berserker could not be humble. His power derived from fearsome reputation. A berserker could not easily show mercy. The fury once triggered did not discriminate. A berserker could not forgive insults. Honor required response to challenges. A berserker could not embrace peace. His entire training and identity were oriented toward violence. Some berserkers presumably converted to Christianity, at least nominally. They might have attended church services, been baptized, accepted Christian burial. But how deeply they internalized Christian belief, how much they truly abandoned pagan practices, we cannot know. The evidence suggests many conversions were superficial, especially in the first generations. Warriors might accept baptism because their king commanded it, but continue pagan practices in private. They might pray to Christ on Sunday and still invoke Odin before battle. The old gods did not disappear from hearts and minds just because official religion changed. Some missionaries and Christian writers attempted to accommodate warrior values within Christianity, reinterpreting rather than completely rejecting. Warriors could be Christian warriors, fighting for the faith rather than for pagan gods. Battle fury could be righteous anger in defense of Christianity. Courage and prowess could be used in crusades against heathens. But these accommodations only went so far. Berserkers specifically, with their association with animal transformation and Odinic cult practices, were harder to Christianize than ordinary warrior culture. The fury itself, the core of berserker identity, remained problematically pagan. Some Christians celebrated the end of berserkers, seeing their disappearance as proof of Christianity's power over pagan darkness. The Christian writer Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, mentioned Norse warriors who had once been feared across Europe, but who were now tamed by the true faith. no longer raging like beasts, but living as civilized Christian men. Other Christians, particularly the saga writers of the 13th and 14th centuries, had more complex attitudes. They lived in fully Christian societies, but they looked back at the pagan past with nostalgia and fascination. Their sagas presented berserkers with ambivalence, admiring their courage and prowess while condemning their pagan association and lack of Christian virtue. The Volsunga saga, though dealing with pagan subject matter, was written by a Christian author who occasionally inserts Christian moral commentary. When describing warriors who transform into wolves and lose control of their fury, attacking each other and innocent people, the saga treats this as curse and tragedy, not as glorious achievement. The berserkers, in Christian retrospective, became cautionary tales, examples of what happens when men pursue power through pagan means, when they value martial prowess above Christian virtue, when they give in to rage instead of cultivating patience and forgiveness. Yet the Christian writers could not entirely condemn them.
The berserkers had been too central to Norse cultural memory, too embedded in stories of kings and heroes, too connected to the shared history that gave identity to medieval Scandinavians. So the berserkers appear in the sagas as tragic figures, men of great ability and courage who were nevertheless flawed, whose pagan nature limited them, who could not fully fit into civilized Christian society. They were sympathetic in their way, but ultimately doomed. This Christian reinterpretation of berserkers helped ensure their survival in cultural memory, even as the reality disappeared. Christianity eliminated berserkers as social fact, but preserved them as literary figures, as symbols, as reminders of a past that was simultaneously rejected and romanticized. The process would continue through centuries, with each era reimagining the berserkers according to its own concerns, until the historical reality became nearly impossible to extract from the layers of interpretation and mythology.
Chapter 15. The Final Berserkers. When and where did the last berserker live? When did the final warrior go berserk in the old way, entering the fury one final time before the tradition ended forever? We cannot name him or give a specific date. The ending was not dramatic, not marked by any memorable last stand. It was gradual, a fading rather than a finish, a tradition that simply stopped being practiced as the social conditions that sustained it disappeared. Based on the evidence, berserkers as a living tradition probably persisted into the mid-12th century in the most remote parts of Scandinavia, northern Sweden, isolated areas of Norway, perhaps parts of Iceland, where Christian influence was weakest and old ways strongest. The last certain historical reference to a berserker as a contemporary rather than historical figure appears in sources from around 1100 to 1130 CE. After this, mentions of berserkers in sagas and chronicles are clearly referring to earlier periods, to the Viking Age, not to the author's present. The disappearance was not complete. Elements of the tradition survived in altered forms. The ability to enter battle fury did not require institutional support. Individual warriors in later periods might have achieved something similar to berserker rage through their own methods, without calling it by that name, without the ritual framework and religious context that had defined the Viking Age berserkers. Medieval knights and warriors throughout Europe sometimes displayed fury and fearlessness in combat that superficially resembled berserker behavior. But these were not berserkers in any meaningful sense. They lacked the specific cultural context, the religious framework, the training methods, and the social role that had defined the Norse berserkers. Some scholars have suggested that berserker traditions might have survived among the Varangian Guard,
the elite Byzantine military unit composed largely of Norse and, later, other northern European warriors, into the 12th and 13th centuries. Norse warriors in Byzantine service might have maintained practices from home, even as those practices disappeared in Scandinavia itself. There is some evidence for this. Byzantine sources mention the Varangians' fearsome reputation, their tendency toward berserk courage in battle, their maintenance of northern cultural practices despite living far from home. Some Varangian warriors returned to Scandinavia wealthy and famous, and they might have carried berserker traditions back with them, even after such traditions had officially ended at home.
But if berserker practices persisted among the Varangians, it was as fossilized tradition, preserved in a foreign context, but disconnected from its original cultural meaning. It was not a living tradition, but a memory kept alive by men far from home. In Iceland, which converted to Christianity later and preserved pagan cultural memory more thoroughly through its saga literature, there is some evidence that berserker reputation, and perhaps limited practice, persisted longer than in mainland Scandinavia. The Vatsdula saga and other sagas set in the 11th and 12th centuries describe characters with berserker characteristics: uncontrolled fury, extraordinary strength, dangerous to their own communities. Some scholars believe these may reflect actual individuals in post-conversion Iceland who maintained aspects of berserker tradition. But by 1200 CE, even in Iceland, the berserker had become a figure of literature rather than reality. Sagas written in the 13th and 14th centuries presented berserkers as characters from the past, from the great age of heroes, not as contemporaries. What killed the berserker tradition? Ultimately, was not persecution alone, though laws against going berserk certainly contributed, but the complete transformation of the society that had created and sustained it. The berserkers had emerged from specific conditions: a warrior culture where reputation was paramount, a pagan religion that valued martial fury, a social structure that rewarded successful violence, economic conditions that made raiding and warfare profitable, a political landscape of competing petty kingdoms where berserkers could sell their services. By the 12th century, all of these conditions had changed. Scandinavia had been Christianized. Powerful, centralized kingdoms had replaced the patchwork of petty chiefdoms. Law codes had replaced personal vengeance. Trade had become more profitable than raiding. Peace was more common than war. The warrior culture itself was being domesticated, transformed into something closer to continental European knighthood. In this transformed world, there was no place for berserkers. Their skills were no longer valuable, their religious practices were criminalized, their social role had disappeared. The young men who in earlier generations might have become berserkers now became farmers, traders, craftsmen, Christian priests, or, if they sought martial glory, they joined crusades or served in regular armies, rather than as specialized berserker warriors. The tradition died because the world that made it possible died, and with its death, something unique in human history ended. A specific form of warrior culture, refined over generations, adapted to specific environmental and social conditions, rooted in particular religious beliefs, producing individuals who achieved altered states of consciousness that made them, temporarily, something more than ordinary human fighters. The last berserker, whoever he was, whenever he lived, probably did not know he was the last. He probably expected that apprentices would follow, that the tradition would continue, that his sons or nephews would learn as he had learned and carry the fury forward. But the apprentices never came. Or if they began training, they were stopped by law or by Christian authorities or by families who wanted different futures for their children. The chain was broken.
And when that final berserker died, the knowledge died with him. Not completely, because the sagas preserved something, but the lived experience, the full understanding of how to achieve and control the fury, the complete practice. These were lost. What remained was memory, story, legend. And it is to these that we must turn as we approach our conclusion, examining how the berserkers have been remembered and reimagined across the centuries since their disappearance.
Chapter 16. Echoes in the Modern World.
Close your eyes one final time. Let the past recede. Feel yourself drifting forward through the centuries, through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, through the World Wars and the Technological Age, until you reach the present moment. The berserkers are gone. They have been gone for 800 years. The last warrior to truly go berserk died before any living person's grandparents were born. And yet they remain. In language, in popular culture, in how we imagine the Viking Age, in psychological terminology, in military metaphors, in the stories we tell about courage and fury, and the thin line between heroism and madness. The word itself persists. When someone goes berserk, when a situation becomes berserk, the ancient Old Norse term lives on. We use it without thinking about its origins, without knowing about warriors in bear pelts chanting around fires, preparing to enter a state that would make them temporarily inhuman. But the meaning has changed. Going berserk, in modern English, simply means losing control, becoming wildly angry, acting without reason. It has lost the religious significance, the idea of divine blessing, the trained achievement of an altered state. It has become entirely negative. To go berserk is a failure of control, not an achievement of power. This linguistic survival alongside semantic shift is characteristic of how the berserkers have been remembered, preserved but transformed, continued but fundamentally changed from their original meaning. The berserkers entered modern popular culture primarily through the Romantic period of the 19th century, when European intellectuals became fascinated with Norse mythology and medieval Scandinavian culture. Writers, artists, and scholars reimagined the Viking Age, often romanticizing and distorting it according to their own cultural concerns. The berserkers, as the most exotic and dramatic element of Viking warrior culture, received particular attention. They appeared in poems, paintings, operas, but they were reimagined as savage, noble warriors, as embodiments of primal masculine energy, as examples of a more authentic, less civilized way of life that industrial Europe had lost. This romantic reimagining stripped away much of the historical complexity, the religious context, the social problems berserkers created, the darkness beneath the fury, the tragedy of warriors who could not control their own power. What remained was a simplified, heroic image. Fearless warriors who fought without armor, who felt no pain, who embodied pure courage.
The 20th century brought new interpretations. The berserkers appeared in fantasy literature, in comic books, in role-playing games. They became character classes, templates for fictional warriors, symbols of the barbarian hero unbounded by civilization's constraints. Popular culture berserkers bore decreasing resemblance to historical reality. They gained supernatural powers, magical invincibility, the ability to transform literally into bears. They became figures of pure fantasy, disconnected from the careful historical record we have examined in this narrative. Military culture and psychology adopted berserker terminology. Special forces operators who display exceptional courage under fire, who seem to ignore injury and fear, are sometimes described as going berserk. The term appears in after-action reports,
in psychological literature on combat stress, in discussions of warrior ethos. But modern military forces do not want true berserkers. They want controlled aggression, disciplined violence that can be turned on and off as tactical situations require. Soldiers who lose control, who cannot distinguish friend from enemy, who attack indiscriminately, these are problems, not assets. The military usage of berserker terminology is thus metaphorical, appreciative of the courage and fearlessness, while implicitly rejecting the loss of control and the indiscriminate violence that characterized the historical phenomenon. Some martial arts schools and historical European martial arts groups have attempted to recreate berserker training methods, drawing on saga descriptions and academic research to develop programs that claim to teach modern practitioners to enter fury states. These efforts are interesting and sometimes sophisticated in their historical knowledge, but they face an insurmountable problem. The cultural and religious context that made berserkers possible no longer exists. You cannot recreate a practice that was embedded in Viking Age paganism, in a warrior culture where violence was everyday reality, in social structures and beliefs completely alien to modern life. What modern practitioners can do is train in combat techniques, study historical weapons, practice inducing adrenaline states through controlled stress. These are valuable activities, but they are not making berserkers in any historical sense. They are engaging with historical memory, with physical culture, with their own relationship to martial heritage. The gulf between this and actual Viking Age berserker practice is profound. In Scandinavia today, the relationship to berserker heritage is complex. There is pride in the Viking past, recognition of its historical importance, but also awareness of the violence and values that modern Scandinavian societies have rejected. The berserkers represent this tension. They are part of cultural heritage, but not necessarily exemplars to be emulated. Some neo-pagan groups have attempted to revive elements of Norse religious practice, including warrior rituals. Some of these groups include berserker practices in their ceremonies. Again, these are interesting as modern religious expression, as ways contemporary people engage with historical beliefs. But they are new creations inspired by the past, not actual continuations of ancient traditions. Academic interest in berserkers has grown substantially in recent decades. Historians, archaeologists, psychologists, and religious studies scholars have produced careful, sophisticated analyses of the evidence. Conferences are devoted to Viking Age martial culture. Articles examine specific aspects of berserker phenomenon in detail. This scholarly work has dramatically improved our understanding, separating fact from later fiction, identifying what can be known with confidence from what remains speculation. The picture of berserkers presented in academic literature today is far more accurate, more complex, and more interesting than the popular culture stereotype. But academic knowledge reaches limited audiences. Most people's understanding of berserkers still comes from movies, television shows, video games, fantasy novels, popular culture sources that prioritize entertainment over historical accuracy. This creates a strange situation. We have better historical knowledge of berserkers than ever before, yet popular misunderstanding may be more widespread than in previous centuries, simply because pop culture representations reach global audiences of billions. The berserkers have become, in a sense, more famous dead than they ever were alive. Every person who speaks English knows the word berserk and has some vague idea of uncontrolled fury. Millions worldwide have encountered fictional berserkers in entertainment media. The name is globally recognized, but very few know the actual history, the religious context, the social function, the training methods, the complex relationship to society, the tragic decline. The berserkers have achieved immortality, but at the cost of their true identity. Perhaps this was inevitable. History is always reinterpreted by succeeding ages. The past does not remain fixed, but is constantly reimagined according to present concerns. Each generation asks different questions of history, finds different meanings in the same events. For the Victorian Romantics, berserkers represented noble savagery and authentic masculinity in an age becoming industrial and soft. For early 20th century militarists, they represented martial spirit in an age of total war. For modern fantasy fans, they represent escape from mundane reality and the appeal of the warrior archetype. For scholars, they represent an interesting case study in the relationship between culture, psychology, and altered states of consciousness. All of these interpretations capture something, miss something. All are ways of engaging with the past, of finding meaning in historical figures who lived entirely different lives in entirely different worlds. What, then, should we take from the story of the berserkers? What lessons, what insights, what understanding justifies our long journey through this history? Perhaps simply this: human beings are capable of remarkable transformations, of pushing beyond normal limits, of achieving states of consciousness that grant temporary powers at significant costs. The specific form this took among Viking Age Norse warriors emerged from their unique circumstances and can never be exactly replicated. But the underlying capacity to transcend ordinary human functioning through training and will and ritual, this remains part of what humans can do. The berserkers were real. They were not supernatural. They were not invincible. But they were extraordinary. Warriors who, through years of training and cultural conditioning, and possibly substances, through religious belief and social pressure and individual will, achieved something remarkable and terrible. They became, temporarily, something more than ordinary human fighters, something that inspired fear across Europe, something that has echoed through a millennium of memory. They paid for this power with their lives. Most died young, in battle, their bodies pushed beyond sustainable limits. They paid with their sanity. The fury damaged them, made them dangerous to themselves and others, cost them the ability to live peacefully. They paid with their place in society. As times changed, they could not adapt, and their skills became crimes rather than virtues. They achieved a kind of glory. They are remembered when thousands of successful Viking Age farmers who lived long lives and died in their beds are utterly forgotten. Their name lives on in language. Their story continues to fascinate. But glory is cold comfort to the dead. The berserkers themselves, could they speak across the centuries, might say the price was too high, the cost too great. Or they might say they had no choice, that this was what fate had woven for them, that they lived as Odin required and died as warriors should. We cannot know. They are silent. The graves give up weapons and bones, but not thoughts or feelings. The sagas preserve stories, but not the truth of lived experience. What remains is what we have examined together through these chapters: fragmentary evidence, careful scholarship, informed speculation, and the enduring human fascination with those who push beyond ordinary limits, who pay terrible prices for extraordinary powers, who live briefly and intensely rather than long and safely. The berserkers are gone, but the questions they raise remain. What are we capable of? What transformations are possible? What costs are worth paying? What does it mean to be human? And what happens when we deliberately become something else? These questions have no easy answers. Perhaps they have no answers at all, but they are worth asking. And the berserkers, in their lives and deaths and long afterlife in memory, help us ask them. And now, slowly, gently, return fully to the present moment. The journey is complete. The story is told. Open your eyes. The berserkers have spoken their truth. Through the fragments that remain, through the sagas and the graves and the linguistic fossil of their name. What you have heard is as close to their reality as centuries of distance allow. The rest is silence, and memory, and the work each generation does of making meaning from the past. The fire has burned down. The darkness is complete, but the story endures. This concludes our exploration of the berserkers, the warriors who became something more than human, who terrified medieval Europe, who served gods and kings and their own fury, who achieved powers at devastating costs, who lived intensely and died young, whose tradition faded into silence, but whose memory echoes still. From their origins in the mists of Viking Age Scandinavia, through their terrible glory in battle, their complex relationship with the societies that both needed and feared them, through their slow decline as the world changed around them, to their final disappearance and their strange afterlife in modern imagination, we have traced the complete arc of their existence. They were real. They were extraordinary. They were human, pushed to and beyond human limits. They were products of their time and culture, yet they transcended their circumstances to become something that still speaks to us across a millennium of silence. Remember them not as cartoon barbarians or fantasy heroes, but as they were, trained warriors who achieved altered states through discipline and belief, and possibly substances, who served a function in their society, who paid terrible prices for their powers, who were both more and less than the legends suggest. Remember that they lived and fought and died, that they had names and families and hopes and fears, that they made choices or had choices made for them, that they were swept up in forces larger than themselves, the tides of history, the transformation of their world, the ending of an age. And remember that something was lost when they disappeared. Not something we should want to recreate, perhaps, but something unique, something that revealed possibilities of human experience that we can barely imagine now. The berserkers are gone. Long live their memory. May their story remind us of the remarkable and terrible things human beings are capable of when culture and belief and will align to push us beyond our ordinary limits. May it remind us that every age has its own forms of glory and its own forms of tragedy. And may it remind us that the past, however distant, speaks to us still, if we will only listen. The saga is ended. The tale is told. The fury has faded into silence. But the memory remains, and will remain, as long as humans tell stories about courage and madness, glory and tragedy, the price of power, and the cost of transcendence. This is the story of the berserkers. This was their truth. This is how they are remembered. And this is where the story ends, in contemplation of what was lost, and what echoes still in the word that names them, in the legends that preserve them, in the questions they force us to ask about the nature and limits of human possibility. Rest now, ancient warriors. Your fury is spent. Your wars are won and lost. Your gods are silent. Your age is gone. But your story endures, and will endure, carried forward by those who seek to understand what you were, what you achieved, what you sacrificed, and what your strange and terrible glory means for understanding what it means to be human. The fire is out. The night is deep. The journey ends. But the story lives on, as all great stories do, in the telling and retelling, in the pondering and wondering, in the eternal human fascination with those who lived at the edges of what is possible.
Farewell, berserkers. Your tale is told. Your truth is preserved, as well as time and distance allow. Sleep now in your northern graves, beneath the stones that mark your resting places, beneath the centuries that separate your world from ours. You have been remembered. Your story has been honored. And that, perhaps, is the only immortality that matters. The saga ends, the silence descends. But the echo remains, and will remain, as long as there are those who listen for voices from the past, who seek to understand those who came before, who wonder at the remarkable and terrible things humans can become when pushed beyond ordinary limits by belief and training and the demands of their age. This is the end. This is how it concludes. This is where we leave them. In memory, in silence, in the long darkness of history, where all the dead await, patient and voiceless, hoping only to be remembered truly, to have their story told honestly, to have their reality preserved against the distortions of time and legend. The berserkers have been remembered, their story has been told. And now, we return to our own time, our own concerns, our own questions, carrying with us what we have learned from these ancient warriors who achieved the impossible at costs we can barely comprehend. The end.